Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. And what today's webinar is Marketing 101 for your business. My name is John Ripple, and I am a Canton SCORE volunteer. This webinar is being sponsored and hosted by Canton SCORE, along with the Stark Community Foundation, the Hoover Foundation, Stark State College, and Small Business Growth Network. So I want to talk just a little bit about SCORE for those that may not be familiar with it. So what is SCORE? SCORE is a nonprofit that's literally been around since 1964. SCORE's mission is to help small businesses survive through mentoring as well as through education. So no matter whether you are starting business, a growing business, or transitioning your business, SCORE will have a mentor for you to help you through the process. So SCORE volunteers as well as mentors within SCORE must follow a strict code of ethics that includes not only not making money from clients, also not using clients' data for commercial purposes. Also, our mentoring sessions are strictly confidential. So SCORE is a resource partner of the Small Business Administration, commonly referred to as SBA. There are over 210 SCORE chapters across the United States with over 10,000 volunteers. SCORE offers counseling that is free of charge for both for-profit as well as nonprofit businesses. So, reach out to your local SCORE, or you can reach out to www.score.org if you need help in any of your business challenges, or if you would like to become a volunteer with SCORE. We're always looking for applicants. So before we actually get started with the webinar, I have a couple housekeeping items I'd like to review with you. So if you do have a question for the presenter today, we really appreciate it if you use the Q&A tab that you find at the bottom of your screen. Please try to avoid using the chat unless you'd like to communicate amongst the people that are attending. So just to reinforce, if you have a question, do record your question or write your question in the Q&A, and we'll bring those questions up to the presenter. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on cantonscore.org's website. Each of you will be receiving a link so you can actually view the webinar at your own convenience. You'll also be receiving a copy of the PowerPoint slides. So today we have the pleasure of having Mike Johnson. Mike is a SCORE volunteer for the Canton chapter. And Mike, I'm going to turn the platform over to you.
All right, John, thanks a bunch. Yeah, I've been with SCORE now for 18 years. And during that time, in addition to mentoring, I have served as a chapter chair and a district director. And John asked me to tell you a little bit about, where I come from. I spent my corporate career with three companies, General Electric, TRW, and Timken. And in all of those positions, I was working mostly in marketing and communications. I did find my portfolio expanding when I got myself involved in things like integrating different functions instead of having a bunch of silos. But I've always had a fondness for marketing, and in particular, marketing planning. And I'll share with you how I got my baptism in that. A month after returning from my Army duty in Korea, I found myself with General Electric. And I had been there for maybe 12 or 15 months when one of the big bosses, and there were 30,000 GE employees in Schenectady, New York at the time, called me to his office. His name was Jim McGarry. And he said that the company had a unit in Erie, Pennsylvania that wasn't performing to expectations. And he said he wanted me to go out there and poke around, learn what I could, and come back and report to him. I probably, as a young kid, maybe 24, 25 years old, relied on a veteran secretary to arrange a series of meetings for me in Erie. But I did go out there and I did poke around. And when I came back, I walked to Jim's office and he said, "Hey, how did it go?" And I said, "Well," I learned one thing. I said that unit, it doesn't have a plan and it needs one. And Jim said, "Well, that's really good information. So go ahead and put together a plan for them." Now I could have said okay, but I would have been blowing smoke. So instead I said, "Jim, they don't have a plan, they need one, and I don't have the foggiest idea of how to put one together." I must say that in the Army, there really wasn't a huge emphasis on strategic planning. It was, here's your mission, go do it. So anyway, Jim wasn't displeased. He just picked up his phone and made a call. And the next thing I know, for the next week, I was starting every day sitting at the elbow of one of General Electric's veteran strategic planners. That was sort of my baptism in strategic planning, and in particular strategic planning as it relates to marketing. So with that bit of an intro, you can see the slide that John has brought up, and you'll see it says where not to start, and that is with tactics. I couldn't begin to count the number of new SCORE clients who want help with marketing, and often they will start out by saying, "Hey, would you like to see a website that I'm developing?" Or, "I've got a new brochure out. Let me show you that." And I always very politely say, "Well, of course, let me see it." But what's really going through my mind is whether or not they have done any of what I call the upfront thinking that is really crucial to putting together a plan that's going to work to their benefit. Next slide, John. So you can see here's two, marketing more than advertising. It just kind of irritates me to see that those two words are used interchangeably. Even in the Wall Street Journal, I often see articles that will talk about marketing while they're using the word advertising. And to me, marketing, or rather advertising, is just one slice of marketing. Can be an important slice, but still only one. So what are we talking about with regard to upfront thinking? Well, the big one is research. And it is a lot easier and less costly than it used to be. I am thinking of a friend named Harvey Weinberg, who had been with one of the big international consultancies for a long time and decided he wanted to go into business for himself, and he was going to specialize in intelligence, gathering intelligence. And he did which was then kind of standard. He went to trade shows, he read certain magazines. He used to laugh and say he would call a company's receptionist because they always seemed to know what was going on inside those companies. But whatever Harvey was doing, it was time consuming, and of course he was billing his clients for all that time he was putting in. If Harvey were here today, I wouldn't be at all surprised to learn that he was out of business. You know, the internet and all the other online search engines have probably made kind of obsolete much of the work that Harvey was doing. So today, to not do research is just kind of a weak excuse because it's just so easy to do. And if you're going to do research, I say, well, think of it as in two ways. There's quantitative and there's qualitative. Quantitative, of course, can provide some good statistical information, but if you have the time and you have the resource, following that up with qualitative, which is getting into what you've learned and start asking individuals questions to explain why they have answered questions that you have put forward. And then, of course, marketing also includes your product, your service, the promotion, the pricing, customer branding, and so on. When you see me glancing to my left, I'm looking over here at some annotations that I've written down over here. And one of the things that I want to, let's see, should we switch? Yeah, let's go to the next slide, John. Yeah, marketing equals reputation, more than a product, more than a service. It's more important than either one. And yeah, I want to ask you just to think about how many times have you bought a brand versus only a price? As I said, I started my career with General Electric, and at that time, GE was one of the two or three major players in the appliance business. And during my years there, I got to visit its appliance park in Louisville, Kentucky, where they had a testing facility. And when you went into that facility, you saw row after row after row of laundry washers, dishwashers, dryers, all being run continuously to determine the design life of those appliances. I mean, I was really impressed. And even though I haven't been with GE for ages, I continued to buy that reputation for excellence. In fact, GE had another brand called Hotpoint, which basically went into apartments and starter homes and so on. But they put every bit as much emphasis on quality for the Hotpoint brand as they did the GE brand, because they always felt that when somebody moved into their own home or a larger home, they would be likely to go with that GE brand, and they would do so with confidence because of the experience they had with Hotpoint. So when a person thinks about marketing, to me, it's really useful to think first about reputation. What is it? What is it built on? And what can you do to strengthen it? And so at the bottom part of that slide, you can see it poses the question, do you achieve a reputation by design or by default? And there are quite a few companies, not just small companies, but larger ones who have a reputation that seems to be more by default than by design. And of course, you do have a choice in any business, whether it's a smaller one or a bigger one, or whether it's nonprofit, to build a reputation by design instead of by default. By default, I simply mean, well, just kind of letting things happen. Okay, next slide. All right, marketing plan vis-a-vis business plan. As John knows, not too long after I arrived at SCORE, I think it was like 10 days maybe, I had my first client. And it was clear that that client needed a strategic plan. And to me, a good strategic business plan really needs to include marketing. So I thought, I wonder what kind of a template that SCORE might have. And I went to SCORE's Nationals website, and there was, and there remains, a really good template for creating a business plan. And it runs 30, 35 pages, something like that. So I thought that could be pretty daunting to a small business or nonprofit that's never put together a plan like that. So I thought back about that baptism I got in planning with General Electric, and what I learned in the course of my work, and in the course of attending a couple of 3-day seminar courses on planning put on by New York University, and said, well, what would be the essence of a really good strategic plan that would blend marketing with business? And I developed a template that runs 3.5 pages. And as John knows, quite a few members of our chapter have adopted that template when working with clients. So you should see that when you're looking at a marketing plan or a business plan, that there's overlap. There really should be overlap to do a business plan without including marketing sounds pretty self-defeating, but to try to do a marketing plan and not bring into it certain elements of the business would also be rather self-defeating. So there should be some overlap. And are there some different considerations? Oh, sure. In the business plan, you're going to put much more of an emphasis on the financial aspects than you would in the marketing plan per se, but that's okay, only to be expected. All right, next slide. Okay, so what we emphasize to businesses, and whenever I say businesses, you can be thinking that I include nonprofits when I say that. And I should add that if you aren't all that familiar with SCORE, we do deal with nonprofits just as we do for-profits. And often people are surprised to learn that we do, but that's part of our charter to work with nonprofits as well as for-profits. So when I say businesses, I'm referring to both categories. So what we encourage businesses to do is to think about opportunities that they have. And there are the ones that, that you can see. And typically that would be a market that's not yet served by your particular product or your particular service. That's an opportunity. And then there are the ones that you can create, and those do require a little more thought. And an example of that would be you're selling products, but you're giving away the consulting. When I joined Timken, we produced some terrific products, and in connection with those products, we were doing a lot of consulting and we were giving away the consulting aspect of that. And as time moved along, we did start to charge for the consulting as well as for the products that we sold. So that's an opportunity that you can actually create for yourself in starting a new business. Next slide, John. Challenges. Okay. When you look down at this slide, after seeing the bullets present and near term and longer term, you see that little kind of sub bullets that says list or define them. And as we move forward through this session, you're going to hear me talking about lists quite a bit. I'm a big fan of lists, and there are a couple reasons for that. But one is, lots of studies have shown that if you write something down, not only do you make it better for yourself to recall what you've been thinking about, but often it leads to your thinking creatively and thinking about things you hadn't thought of before. So there are challenges that you face in the present. There are others in the near term, those in the longer term, but start creating lists. Write them down, all of those challenges that are out there. Okay, next slide. Okay. I really like to encourage businesses to create what I call the statement of situations. This is really meant to cause people to think a little bit more broadly as well as a little bit more in depth about what they're attempting to do. And so basically, that statement of situation can start by your listing all the facts that come to mind that you think are going to be relevant to your success. Think about that for just a moment. All the facts, they can be positive, they can be negative, but they are facts that will be relevant to your success. And to do that, you really need to take or make time to do the research. And I'll deviate here a little bit to talk about how fast this research can work and how beneficial it can be. In my post-corporate phase of life, I have written some books. 6 of them are historical novels, and 3 of those are set during World War II. Yeah, I've traveled the world doing the research. And in one of the books, I wanted to tell the story of the Navy's role in D-Day. And, most of us are familiar with the Army's role, especially if you've seen movies like The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could tell what it would be like to be on the first Allied ship to fire on occupied France on D-Day? And my first thought was, well, I guess I'll just, create a ship. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. I wonder with a little bit of time and a little bit of effort, I could find the first ship to fire in occupied France. You know what? It didn't take me but 10 or 15 minutes. And I was reading about a destroyer called the USS Corey. It was, in fact, the first ship to fire in occupied France, and it did not survive. Uh, German artillery hit it. It passed over a mine. It broke in half. And it didn't lose a single man because there were all those thousands of ships following it in. So all the crewmen were rescued. But the bigger point was it only took 10 or 15 minutes to find the USS Corey. Then I say on that slide, you can see record your findings. And that's just another way of saying make a list. So I can't emphasize enough the benefit. And by the way, when I say write them down, okay, you can pound away on a keyboard and do this, but do create lists, and you're going to find that having those lists are going to be genuinely beneficial as you move along. Okay, the next slide. And the next one I had coming up after statement of situation. Next slide. The marketing planning ladder. Okay. Now this is if you had that template I've created, the first page of that template would have this marketing planning ladder. And I like to use the word ladder because I view those elements that you're looking at there as the various rungs on a ladder. And of course, it's the connection of those rungs that gives strength to the ladder. So I really encourage people to start with aspirations. And aspirations are thoughts that you have that go beyond the next year or two. In other words, if everything broke your way when you were starting a business, what would it look like 5 or 10 years down the road? In other words, this is an invitation to dream. And why do I encourage clients, SCORE clients, to first think about aspirations? Because typically it results in some creative thinking. People begin to think about elements that they hadn't thought of before simply because they're allowing themselves to dream. Next, we say, well, what are those opportunities? Remember, we talked about listing the opportunities that you see out there. And then you see the challenges. And remember, each one of these is a rung on a ladder. You should see strong connections between each of these as you move down the ladder. The statement of situation, we've talked about that and how it requires doing research. Then come objectives, and we'll talk about that more in detail, but the one key point I want to make is that in deciding what your objectives are, and now we are talking about objectives for the next 1 year, the next 2 years, maybe the next 3, but to the extent possible, make sure the objectives that you include in your plan are measurable. The more measurable objectives you have, the better you're going to be able to gauge the progress you are making with a business. And then come strategies. And the strategies are not to be used interchangeably with objectives. I view strategies as what I call the broad how-tos that you will employ to achieve those measurable objectives that you have settled on. And I'll give you a couple examples. So a broad strategy might be participating in trade shows. Now you don't write, at this point, you don't list those, but you just say this is a broad strategy. Another one would be making more effective use of social media. Okay, but you don't have to get into various platforms yet, just a broad strategy. Another one might be getting speaking engagements in front of local civic or social groups. No need to get into the details now, but you're looking at what you regard as broad strategies, broad how-tos that will help you achieve measurable objectives. And then we come to audiences. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but basically we're talking about all the various constituents that are out there that can help you succeed in your business. Audience expectations, we'll have a little fun talking about that in just a few minutes because often businesses flub divining audience expectations. Then we come to messages, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But fundamentally, we want you to be thinking about messages that will cause the recipients of the messages to take actions that you desire. And then, guess what? We finally come to tactics. You know, that new brochure or that website that's in process. I'm well recalling, I might mention this again later, so I'll go get through it now. But I had a new client. I was asked to speak to the merchants of a small town, and it was to begin at 7 in the morning in a restaurant. I got there early, and somebody had arrived and got the coffee started. That was good. And a woman came in and she introduced herself as running a business called the Teddy Bear Shop. And she said she just had a sign installed outside of the town and she wasn't sure if it was working. And I was thinking, okay, have you done any of what I would call upfront thinking before you had a sign installed outside of town? By the way, I can mention her name because all the counseling we do with clients is confidential, but there are two exceptions, and one of those is if we want to publicly recognize a client for its success, we need to get permission from the client to do that. And I can say in my 18 years with SCORE, we've never had a client say, oh no, I don't want any public recognition for my business. Well, the Teddy Bear Shop, I won't go into great detail here at this point, but they became one of our clients of the year as a result of doing some upfront thinking that they had not done previously. Then we go to pricing. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how sensitive that is. We'll talk about budgeting, and keep in mind that that first budget that a business puts together creates what I call a foundation for or a spending history that will allow you to do a better job of creating a budget in years to come. Feedback, you'll hear me talk more about that and how important it is. And we finish up with KPIs or key performance indicators. And by the way, at this point, I should emphasize that our SCORE chapter follows this kind of a ladder. We do give ourselves annually goals for certain categories of our work, and we review those once a month, and that's for the entire chapter membership. Okay, next slide, John. Aspirations. Yeah, so as I said a few moments ago, here's where I want you to peer far into the future and imagine things. What if things really broke your way? How would it look? You know, how would you benefit? And in doing so, you need to recognize that your dreams themselves might change as you get farther along and with your experiences. But importantly, you see off to the right, I say, when you're thinking about those dreams, write them down. It's just, I warned you, I was going to be talking about writing things down and making lists as we move through this program this morning. Next slide. Okay. So marketing objectives. You already heard me say that to the extent possible, the objectives you set for yourself should be measurable. And I also believe that if you're really thinking through deeply and broadly about what it is you want to achieve, you should be able to cite at least 3 or 4 measurable objectives. And if you can't, I have a message for you. Think harder. And by the way, this might be an opportunity or a point in time when I should introduce the subject of the day or the hour now, and that's artificial intelligence. There's no question that AI is playing a growing role in almost seemingly everything that we do in or outside of business. I just think that at this stage, depending too heavily on AI is going to reduce the creativity of the thinking that you should be engaging in. And one of the things I really should emphasize is that putting together a really good strategic marketing plan is not supposed to be easy. And it's not supposed to be easy because it is forcing you to think and think harder and think deeply. And I can't emphasize enough how that approach will also lead to a level of creativity that probably is going beyond where you are right now with regard to thinking about starting a business or a business that you have in place that you would like to see grow or expand. All right, next slide. Okay. Yeah, marketing strategies, as I said when we were looking at that ladder, with strategies, we're talking about the broad how-tos of planning. And when you say written out, say 5 measurable objectives, you then should articulate some strategies and you should see some strong linkages between the strategies and the objectives. And if you don't see it, if it's not clear, then you need to really rethink those strategies. So keep in mind that the strong linkages there and those strategies are meant to support your ability to meet your measurable objectives. And you can see too, that last bullet down there, the strategizing is evolving with a growing emphasis on electronic media, social media, and increasingly AI. Let's see, the broad how-tos. Yeah, I spoke earlier about, speaking engagements, trade shows, possibly joining chambers of commerce. And by the way, if you join a chamber of commerce or a civic organization, you need to do more than pay your dues. You need to become involved with the activities there. Take advantage of all the networking opportunities that most of these organizations create. And some of my most successful clients are ones who have really thrown themselves into the networking that's possible when you join these organizations. Okay, next slide. Okay, audiences. You talk to somebody who is starting a business of any kind, profit, nonprofit, and their first inclination is to say, "Oh, I know who my audiences are." And I I like to think about a woman who came to SCORE and she wanted to open a high-end boutique that would specialize in purveying high-end apparel. And in the course of that first meeting, I said, "Well, who are your audiences?" And she said, "Well, that's women with money." I said, "Okay, but let me ask you a few questions." She said, "All right." I said, "Well, these women, do you see that some of them are wives?" "Oh, sure, of course." "And you expect that maybe some of them are mothers?" "Yes." "And how about grandmothers?" "Yeah, probably." "And do you think any men might come into your shop?" "Yeah, probably. And some of those are boyfriends or fathers or grandfathers." "Yeah." Well, all of a sudden, her list of potential audiences it was growing. And that became really important, as you'll see when we get into messaging. So don't assume at the very beginning that you know who your audience or audiences are. Typically, when I challenge people to start writing them down, to listing them, the number of the audiences also grows or expands. Um, Here's a good example of assuming. When I joined General Electric, I was assigned to work with a unit that was the second most profitable unit in the whole company. And it was run by a man by the name of Peter Van Dyke. And I would remember I was just this corporate kid, if you will. But in meeting with him once, I asked him about how widely known his business was. And it had that business had facilities in over 100 cities around the country. And I still remember, oh, everybody knows about us. You know, we're leaders in our business, and you know, we have a wonderful reputation. Everybody knows about us. And I remember saying, by the way, he told me to call him Pete, not Mr. Van Dyke. I said, well, Pete, would you let me do a little research, pick out one of these facilities you have, and try to get a good handle on how many of the potential clients out there know about you? And he said, well, okay, Mike, we'll let you do that. And we did. We went ahead with some quantitative research, and we found that 85% of potential customers had not heard of his business, his facility. 85%. He was floored, shocked. But it went to the underscored the ill wisdom of assuming you know who your clients are. So, all right, let's move on. Next slide. Audience expectations. Wow, I can't tell you how many businesses flub divining the expectations of their audiences. And why is that? Well, it's because to accurately divine the expectations of the audiences, you have to crawl outside of your mind. And then you have to crawl inside the mind of those audiences and only then ask, what do they expect from us? And I'm going to cite two examples, one where the business did a good job and the other where they don't. The one that was doing a bad job happened to be my undergraduate alma mater, Ohio University. My late wife and I were going to be hosting friends of ours who are from the Netherlands. And we thought, well, what can we do with or for Peter and Jose that they wouldn't have experienced in the Netherlands? And we had already visited them in their home. And we saw in looking at the calendar that they were going to be here over the weekend when Ohio University would have its annual homecoming. And that annual homecoming weekend was loads of fun, all kinds of activities going on. And we agreed, yep, this is probably unlike anything they've experienced in the Netherlands. So I called a ticket office at Ohio U, and it took me through, it was one of these automated systems, and it took me through like 6 or 7 questions I had to answer or make choices on. What it didn't do at the end was connect me with a live person who would take my money. I was floored. Well, since I'm an involved alum, I went a little higher up the food chain, and I found a more senior person and explained the experience I just had. Well, he personally arranged for me to spend my money to buy all the tickets I wanted. But to his credit, he also immediately ordered a change in that phone system so that somebody would wind up talking to a real live person who would make it easy to spend their money. They had clearly not done a good job of divining the expectations of their customers. The opposite of that was a fellow who his name was Stan Galt, and who when I was just a kid at GE, he was running the appliance business. And then many years later, I had a GE appliance, which it was a washing machine, and it failed after about 13 months. And with having 3 young kids, you don't mess around. So I just, we got a repair person to come out and fix it. And then I thought, in the GE org chart, there was a position called regional manager. And I thought, I'm just going to write a letter to the area regional manager for Northern Ohio. Not a nasty letter, but just explaining that as a former GE employee and a loyal GE buyer, I was just disappointed that a GE washing machine failed after 13 months when I knew the design life was at least a dozen years. So I wrote the letter, and within a week or so, I got a phone call from that regional manager, and he apologized, but he said, do you still have a copy of the invoice for that repair job? I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, would you send that to me? I did. And about a week later, I got a check for the amount that it had cost me to hire a repairman. Well, years later, the man who had been running that appliance business was now on the board of directors for Timken. And he and I found ourselves on a plane together flying off to a Timken facility. And I told him the story I just related. And he said, "Oh," he said, "I'm not surprised that regional manager reacted the way he did and did what he did." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because I insisted that all my senior people personally get involved with the experiences of customers." So they were doing an excellent job of defining the expectations of their customers. All right, next slide. Messages. Okay. Uh, a lot of businesses flub these as well. I mean, how often have you watched a TV commercial for a product or a service, and when the ad ends, you ask yourself, what were they selling? What were they trying to persuade me to buy? And I asked myself, I just wonder the extent to which an ad agency persuaded that it had this really cute commercial, and they sort of just kind of overwhelmed the client into agreeing with it. Um, Yeah, too many businesses just assume that their marketing efforts, whatever form they take, are connecting with clients or customers or potential customers. Well, that just isn't the way it works. And so, as I say, what you want to do is create messages which are going to cause the recipients to take actions that you desire. And what kind of actions do you desire? Well, fundamentally, you want a potential client or customer to want to learn more about you, and they want to learn more about what you do, and they want to learn more about how you do it. Ultimately, of course, the action you desire is that they're going to buy your product or service. So when you're looking at messages, you have to start by asking yourself, oh, are these the messages that are going to cause the recipients to take the actions that I desire? And I always then emphasize that, look, start with developing a package of maybe core messages. Could be 3 to 5 of them. But these are messages that you're going to use in all of your marketing. And in fact, I used to say to the other senior people at TRW and Timken that just about the time that you're sick of seeing these core messages is just about the time that other people are going to start to absorb them. A good example, by the way, of that is watch a football game and you'll see maybe the same commercial from the same company showing, say, 3 times during the first half. That is not an accident. They know that just about the time that you, the advertiser, is getting sick of your own ads, it's just about the time that the recipients are beginning to absorb them and to act upon them in ways that you desire. And then you need to create what I call the supporting messages. Those are the ones that are aimed at particular audience segments. So remember, you got core messages that you want to include in all of your marketing, but then you look at those different audiences that you've identified and ask, oh, wait a minute, there are probably ought to be some messages that we want to use that are going to zero right in on that particular audience segment. This takes a little bit of thinking. And again, I just asked myself, are we at a point yet where AI could do this as thoroughly, as deeply, and as effectively as you can as you think through and think more creatively about everything that you're doing? And then you'll see there's a bullet there that says prioritize. Why? Okay. Everything that you have that mentions your business, you need to regard as a tactic. And what is the most common, smallest tactic you have? It's your business card. And to me, every business card should include the core message that you conclude is the single most important one you can convey. You don't want to clutter up a business card with 3 to 5 core messages. So prioritize them and ask yourself, as I look at those core messages, which is the one that I really want to get out there? And I'm going to start with my business cards, then it should be on letterhead, then it can be on invoices, but every one of the items that you have that will be seen by members of the public, you should regard as a marketing tactic. And yes, the bottom bullet there talks about repetition. There's just not enough to be said about repetition and its benefits. Don't back away from doing something because you've done it before. Keep at it. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. Marketing tactics. You remember farther up that ladder, we had our strategies. Now you take those broad strategies and you break them down into the tactics. And here's where you get very specific. So, for example, if you're going to be seeking speaking engagements, now here is where you list the various organizations or clubs that you're going to approach. And again, I urge you to create a list of the targets that you're going to be pursuing. There's if nothing else, every time you connect with someone on one of those lists, you get to check it off. You know, you get a little bit of a rush there. Say, okay, I did this one. All right, check it off. But you should, most importantly, see a strong link with the strategies, which, as I said before, those should support your objectives. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Marketing tactics. Yeah, they are becoming less expensive. I mean, in my corporate life or my post-corporate life, I mentioned that I'd written some books, and I knew that an author, if he wants to see his book put in the hands of readers, needs to be central to the marketing of the book. And I asked myself, well, okay, what can I do to help spread the word? And I thought, gee, given all my involvements with different organizations, I have an email database of maybe at that time 3,000 or 4,000. And I thought, okay, I guess the first thing I'm going to do is get those core messages out about my first book to all those people for whom I have email addresses. And by the way, I've counseled over 60 first-time authors, and I say to them, you've got to get past what I call your innate sense of modesty and let people know that you have written a book. Well, in starting a business, you need to let everybody you know out there know that you have started a business. So you've got to get past the innate sense of modesty that we all have about communicating about what we're doing and maybe the successes we're enjoying, but it is central to do that. I remember the first time I sat at the computer to start notifying all those people about my first book, I blushed, right? I was thinking, oh my God, this is going to sound like bragging, but I also knew that was a must. So, yes, think about some of the basic things uh, uh, like an email list, but also increasingly look at Facebook, or increasingly, if you've got the time and the effort and the energy, to other platforms that are out there, which really have you spending more time doing that sort of thing, but which can expand the breadth of the marketing that you're doing. And on that same slide, you'll see down at the bottom it says, but don't overlook the traditional. And then underneath that it says a leave behind piece. Back in the beginning of my career at GE, I was working with one of the units of the company, and everybody in that unit had a business card, and business cards are terribly perishable. And I was thinking, well, what can they do to make their business cards less perishable? And so I came up with the idea of creating a one-page fact sheet. One page. And at the top of that page would simply be the name of the business. And then under that would be the 3 or 4 core messages. And under those would be what I call some other relevant facts. And at the bottom would be all the contact information that you would want a recipient to have. And then I emphasize that in designing that one pager, you should leave room at either the top right or the top left to staple the business card. In other words, make that business card less perishable. And then I thought, yes, and they should always work with an 8.5 by 11 format because guess what? That's what file folders were designed to accommodate. And then I thought, yeah, but you could also use that 8.5 by 11 formatting as in what we call a trifold, something that's folded twice, but it still fits nicely within a folder. That worked out so well that it kind of took on a life of its own around the company. And then when I went on to TRW and later Timken and now SCORE, I continue preaching the value of creating the what I call the one-page fact sheet or the one piece of leave behind that will tell people more about your business and make your business card less perishable. Next slide. Okay, social media. How smart are you? If necessary, get smart fast. Learn to employ effectively. Um, when I wrote that first book, a friend of mine said, "You need to have a website." I said, "Yeah, I know I do." He said, "Well, look, you create the content and I'll design the website for you." Well, that's what we did. But then I quickly realized, yeah, well, the website is out there, but what we really have to do is drive people to the website. And if you're in that position where you have a website, you need to be very cognizant of the necessity of driving people to the website. Now, how do you do that? Well, for one thing, it means that in every marketing tactic that you employ, you include the web address. And if somebody goes to the website, that should have links to other social media platforms that you're using. Something as fundamental as Facebook. On your website, there should be a link to Facebook. And guess what? On Facebook, if you're using that, there should be a link back to your website. Well, that applies to all the various social media that you might be using. You want to make sure you're driving them to your website, but then driving them to each other. Okay, next slide. See, we're bumping up 53 minutes. Okay. Pricing. Oh, wow. Well, I always emphasize to SCORE clients, for-profit, nonprofits both. Look, I want you to start by creating two lists. One of the lists are going to be your fixed cost. Those are the costs that you're going to be incurring on a very regular, predictive basis, starting with rent, utilities, and so on. But then also a list of variable costs, those items that you're not going to need on a regular basis, but occasionally or you're going to reach a point in time where you will need them. Now, cite an example. It might be a printer that you have. It might be a need to replace a phone. But you start by creating those two lists of fixed cost and variable cost. And and those are going to be what I call the foundation for creating a budget and a budget history. In other words, the very first budget that you create for a business is going to require you to do a good bit of estimating. That's okay. And then your first year results are going to give you a foundation for creating more accurate budgets as you move forward. But remember to start with the two lists, fixed cost and variable cost. And pricing sensitivity, you see there, uh, in the pricing, I urge people to be ready to experiment and to listen to feedback. And when my first was put out, the publisher had a retail suggested retail price of $30.99 on the hardcover version. It was also published in the softcover, and it was a 420-page book. That seemed reasonable. And then I got an email from a potential reader who said, "Oh, I saw your book on Amazon and I really liked the description of it, but I don't know, $30.99 seemed a little expensive." Now, I could have dismissed that. But instead, I did a little work. I took a copy of that book along with a bubble wrap and took it to the local UPS store and said, "All right, how much would it cost me to send this to anywhere in the United States?" And they gave me a price. Then I took the same book to the post office and said, "How much to send this anywhere inside the United States?" I handed them the book, handed them the bubble wrap, and they told me, and it was only like 1/3 the price of UPS. And they even had a category of mail called media mail. And so I replied to that man who sent me the email and said, hey, what if you could have that hardcover book with a nice inscription in it, and $25 would include packaging? And his reply was, well, where do I send the check? And so that told me a little bit about paying attention to feedback and being a little bit willing to experiment. And oh, I should add to you that publishers just don't hand out untold numbers of books to authors, but they do sell copies to authors at a deep discount off that suggested retail price. And so when you're pricing a product or pricing a service, be open to some experimenting and certainly be open to the feedback that you're getting. Next slide. Yeah, the marketing budget I talked about, you're going to build a spending history. You're going to do those two lists I talked about, the variable cost, the fixed cost. And let's see, linking to tactics. Create a budget timeline. That's, I think, extraordinarily helpful. When you've got those lists, then start mapping them out on a calendar, a 12-month calendar, and so that you can see, well, here's how much I think I need to spend on money in advertising in March. Here's how much I have left. Where should I slot the remainder of what I have available? And in the end, by building this kind of a budget and using your budget history, as I say there, you're going to increase what I call spending confidence and calm. You're not going to be shocked later on in the year. You'll be able to look at where you are and spend with confidence and calm. Next slide. Let's see, feedback. Yeah, here's another a kind of activity which too many businesses flub. You got to listen to your feedback, or you have to read your feedback. Oh, I see a typo there. We got feedback. Oh, anyway. But hey, it's one thing to listen to it and read it, record it. It's kind of the a cousin, if you will, of creating a list. But you record the feedback and then you should review it periodically, and you should definitely use it to amend your marketing plan. You might, after looking at your feedback, decide, oh, hey, there's another measurable objective we should be working toward. Or it might mean, yeah, here's a message we haven't been emphasizing. It looks like we probably should. So you look at the feedback as an opportunity to get creative and to strengthen your planning. We at SCORE practice what we preach. I remember when we first introduced a workshop for nonprofits. The workshop was geared toward helping a nonprofit operate more like a for-profit business. It was a 2-hour workshop. It was oversubscribed. We rented a room that was going to accommodate, I think it was 40, but we had over 50 people register for it. So we knew we were on to something. But we also asked for feedback. We passed out an evaluation sheet at the end of that workshop, and we learned that, gee, it was really good, but we really wish there would have been more detail. The reaction from us, we expanded the 2-hour workshop to a 3-hour workshop. We did that, and we continued to ask for input, feedback. And one of those was, well, this is a really great workshop for startups, but our nonprofit has been around for a good long while. We're looking for ways to help grow it, to expand its reach, its breadth. Well, we paid attention to that, and what we decided to do was to create a second workshop, one workshop for new nonprofits, and a second one for workshops that have been around for a good while and had different needs, and that has worked out splendidly. So basically what I'm saying is we pay attention ourselves to the feedback we get, and by the way, if you're a SCORE client, or have been a SCORE client, you know that you get an email asking you some questions about how you reacted to your first session. And if you continue with this, I think it's after the third session, you get another email asking you for your thinking on how things went, how you reacted to it. And we as SCORE mentors, we get to see the feedback that comes in, and we regard that feedback as a learning tool. We're learning more about what a customer expects, what they want, and our ability to provide that. All right, next slide. Key performance indicators, KPIs for short. You use those to track the progress against those measurable objectives. And I encourage people to create a spreadsheet. And over on the left side, the left column, it shows you the measurable objectives that you have. And then you plot the progress you're making on a month-by-month basis. And then on the far right, you have the actual numerical goal that you're pursuing. And as I say to people, when you look at one of those measures, and if you're out in October and you see that you're going to meet or exceed that particular goal, good, pat yourself on the back. But what if you get out there to October and it looks like you're going to fall short? Well, you don't say, woe is me. Instead, you start asking yourself some questions like, what should we be doing better? What should we be doing more of? What new things should we be introducing? But in other words, if you're falling short on one of those measurable objectives, you treat that as an opportunity to think creatively and to strengthen your business. Okay, next slide. Multiple performance indicators. Yeah, in other words, to distill everything on this slide, it gets back to the measurable objectives you're going to have. And as I said earlier, you really ought to have at least 3 to 5 measurable objectives. It could be the number of customers, it could be annual sales, and net income would be another, repeat clients or customers could be another. The list goes on, but the extent to which you can articulate measurable objectives and then track your progress on those are really going to help you keep a close eye on the progress you're making throughout the year. Okay, next slide. KPIs. Yeah, I talked about, I prefer to see people use a chart that shows progress on a monthly basis, but quarterly can work. In fact, I've had some clients who want to do that, but the two basic benefits of using the KPIs are there at the bottom. It increases the rigor of your thinking about the business that you're running, and it spurs creativity. Okay, the next slide. The marketing plan. Hey, look, don't let yourself do a marketing plan that becomes static. Don't just stick the finished plan on a shelf and let it gather dust. Don't put it in a drawer and forget about it, but instead create it as a living document. And in one of my corporate, as I was a senior exec, we had to review those plans monthly. Okay. Well, I'm not asking or recommending that a small business or a nonprofit review them monthly, but you ought to at least review them twice a year and then use the feedback that you've been getting to take a good hard look at what you're doing and how you're doing it. But in other words, create your marketing plan as a living document. Okay, the next slide is the last slide, and that's where I'm saying thanks, but create your own good luck. And how do you create your own good luck? You do it by remembering to think strategically. That was the last slide. Do we have any questions, John?
Yeah, Mike, there's a couple of them refer back to the marketing plan template that you mentioned in the beginning, and they're asking whether we can provide whether a copy or
We
a link to
we
that.
can happily email that template to anyone who provides us with an email address.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe whomever logged into this, we can actually include that in the.
Yeah, why don't you do that, John? Why don't you do
Okay,
that?
yeah, we can
And
do
that
that.
reminds me, I'll make sure that I email you. I every now and then I tweak that template a little bit, and I'll make sure that I email you
The
the
latest.
up-to-date version of it.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. Another question goes back to you're talking about your core message. Says how long should your core message be,
Oh,
and
excellent question.
how can you tell us if it's a good one?
Yeah, well, okay. That's an excellent question. I really recommend that when you begin to articulate a message, that you write it in a complete sentence. Do you remember your elementary school grammar? A complete sentence is a subject, a verb, and an object. All right, start with a complete sentence for each messages. Then it is very likely that in using those core messages, you're going to distill some of those sentences into words or phrases. But start with a complete sentence because it tends to really strengthen the thinking that goes into creating that message. And what was the last part of that question, John?
How do you know if it's a good one?
Well, I think experience is going to provide the answer to that. But remember, we talked about research, and the research you do is certainly going to, if you do it well, it's going to help you identify which of the messages are working and which ones aren't. Um, and some of these messages, some of the advertising you see on TV, you can tell which ones are working because they keep repeating them. I mean, I don't know of any large company with a big advertising budget who is not doing its best to learn how effective those ads are, and then they make changes as the research suggests. So, yeah, your success is going to give you a good feel for how well that messaging is working. You just have to be prepared to look at how things are going, how you're doing, and ask yourself, well, is the feedback we're receiving suggest any changes that we should be making to our messaging?
And here's an interesting question. I'd like to see maybe how you can address it, Mike. The question is, how do you position your business to be the top shelf supplier? Hmm.
Well, you remember I used the word reputation?
Mm-hmm.
The extent to which you can build a reputation for quality, a reputation for reliability, a reputation for listening to customer needs, all of those things are going to be the supports of your reputation, and that is going to be fundamental to your success. And by the way, when I joined one of my companies, their approach to customers was, here's our product, take it or leave it. I was shocked. And it took the chairman and I urging people to stop thinking that way and to start asking customers, what do you need? What do you want? Not just what we have to offer you. So that will, taking that approach definitely strengthen the company's reputation in key markets. So that's the best answer I can give offhand.
That's good, Mike. Appreciate that. There is a question from Fernando. It's not specific to your workshop here, but they ask it, is there a score to visit in Lynn, Massachusetts? If that person's still on, I suggest you go out to www.score.org, and there's the ability to put in your zip code, and it'll find a mentor that's closest to you.
And John, let me add to that while it is definitely beneficial to be able to meet in person with a SCORE mentor, if you find that there's a SCORE mentor in a geographic area that's outside of your own, we do mentoring not only in person, but we use Zoom.
Correct.
I mean, I've worked with clients as far off as, Minnesota, Wisconsin, California, and so on, and it's because they have concluded that I have something to offer that may not be offered by the local SCORE chapter. And in fact, John, as you know, sometimes SCORE chapters recommend clients to other SCORE chapters
That's
when
correct.
they recognize that, right, that one chapter might have some expertise that isn't as strong as it is in another of the chapters.
Well, Mike, that's all the questions I see. I really appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule and do this presentation. It was excellent. Even though I sat through it many times, I always learn something from you, Mike. So again, I appreciate.
All right, and John, after we finish up here, as I said, I'll email you the most recent version of that template.
Very good. For those that are still on, thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Are you still on board, John?
Yes.
It looked like at one point we had something like 50 participants.
83.
83?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.